Hello. Hi. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good evening. Why are you still up at midnight? Hello, wherever you are. Welcome to yet another Jax panel at Virtual HorrorCon. This time we are doing Saying Yes, Enthusiastic Consent and Risk Mitigation. And I want to go a little bit deeper into that and what I mean by saying yes in terms of safety and risk mitigation. But first, I would love to introduce our lovely panelists. We're going to go left to right on my screen. So we'll start with Rue. Rue, if you want to introduce yourself, give us your pronouns, and tell lovely people where they can find you.
Hello, my name is Rue. I use they or he pronouns, and you can find me on Twitter as Ilana Knight 13 and everywhere else as just Ilana Knight. I'm a tabletop game designer, sensitivity consultant, and an actual play performer.
Hell yeah. Paula.
Hi, I'm Paula. You can find me on Twitter at audio. I'm a horror GM mostly, but sometimes I do wholesome things against my will if you ask very nicely. I do a lot of TTRPG stuff. I draw, but I do all the things. So primarily for this panel, I do a lot of horror content.
Awesome. Steffie.
Hi, I'm Steffie. I'm a tabletop writer, designer, developer. I mostly write horror, and sometimes people ask me for things that are not horror, and then I usually just make them scary and spooky anyway. And I'm very excited about this panel. My pronouns are she, her.
And Nick.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Francia, at Nobleman Nick. My pronouns are he, they, and I am a production manager and visual effects artist, as well as a actual play streamer and part-time tabletop designer. And yeah, I'm really excited for this.
Yay. And hi, I'm Jacqueline Bryk, otherwise known as Jax Romana or just Jax. You can find me most places on the internet as Rufflejax. That's RUFFLEJAX, no spaces, no underscores. I am a tabletop developer, writer, editor. I've done almost everything you can do with production of tabletop books, with the exception of like layout, marketing, actually putting books together, or art. I found out this morning that the Cult Divinity Lost book that I wrote an essay on traumatic horror for has been nominated for an Emmy for Best Writing, which I am so thrilled about. It's called Beyond Darkness and Madness. My chapter is called Prisons of the Self, so please go take a look at that if you're interested. It is one of my favorite pieces of writing I've ever done. And my pronouns are she, her, they, them, and they, femme. I bring up this book that I worked on because something I did in Prisons of the Self is I wrote about how to take real life trauma and put it into your game both sensitively and effectively. And I think that's a really important thing we should be able to do with playing pretend. But something I notice a lot in tabletop books is whenever someone starts a safety section, you get the, if you don't think this game should be safe, shut this book now. We don't want you. You're probably a bad person. And I feel that's not the tone I want to strike with my risk mitigation or my safety strategies. So I would really love to go around the panelists, and let's start by talking a little bit about how you view the use of safety in games and what some of your favorite safety and risk mitigation tools are. If you want to start, just go ahead and raise your hand. Paula.
I mean, yeah, so I run a lot of dark games, and I've definitely introduced almost all of my regular home game players to safety tools conceptually. And what that means, because, you know, I play my home games with my friends, and there's this assumption, and you might have heard this from a player who might be in theory anti-safety tools or coming across that way as like, we're all friends though. This is my home group. I don't have to do this with my friends at home. That's something you do when you play with strangers, if at all. And I'm the one who introduced my friends to safety systems. And a lot of the way I talked about it, none of them were particularly against it, but talking about why it's important is simply making it seem, it's so obvious, and it probably is obvious to everyone here on this panel, but making it seem casual. I'll use an example here that all of my games use these lovely cards.
Oh, those are my
favorite little guys here. But the way I talk about them is very careful because this one looks scary and it definitely replaces out like these two together as kind of an X card. But I've played in very traumatizing games that had an X card on the table, but the X card was referred to almost exclusively as a panic button. If you are panicking, hit the panic button and everything stops and the focus is all on you. as like, and I never hit the X card and I was very uncomfortable the whole time. And so whenever I talk about this, if it's on stream, I say we cut the stream. Or if we're in a home game, I say we take a break. And it can be used for any casual occurrence of that, or simply, you know, I need things to stop. And with this, it's like, hey, you crossed a line, but in a way where it's not going to be a whole conversation. It's just like, hey, you mentioned a mosquito and I said no insects. Can we just say that never happened? But it does need to be mentioned. And so to add this more casual occurrence of it, suddenly everyone's like, oh, I would have just said that, but now we have quick ways to do it if I can't find the words fast enough, or if two people are having an excellent and beautiful scene and I don't want to jump in and say that, like, it's not making things more strict or more structured. It is simply reformatting tools for the sake of a gameplay. Like if you were having a conversation over lunch, you might be like, hey, that's not cool. Can we like change the subject? But if in games, it's sort of narrative, it's theatrical. So let's create tools that add to that structure that already is in place.
I love that. That's awesome. Also, I love your cards. Those are really cool.
I made them. They're really nice.
They're fabulous. Who would like to go next?
So I am currently working on a Larp, hoping that, you know, we can meet people again. And one thing I'm doing is I'm using hand signs because you're already using body language for everything. So I wanted to make the hand signs is the player communicating with the player, which is different than the character communicating. So we've got hand signs for I love it, keep it coming, escalate, make it worse. We've got a hand sign for this is fine, but this is also where I want to keep it at. We've got a hand sign for that's it, we're stopping. Stop the game, call a narrator, we need to do something else. And then there's a hand sign for how are you feeling? Because if you're like, I can't read you and I'm not sure what you want me to do, so I'm going to ask how you are. So those are the 4 hand signs. And then I did say that before the game, I'm going to go over them with everyone, and I do expect everyone to use them and adhere to them. We're going to practice them together so that everybody knows what they're like. And then I'm hoping that by practicing them, people will be over that first hurdle of using them, because you already did in a group session with everyone. So that's the Larp.
That reminds me very strongly of something that I've seen used in different types of American and European LARP styles, which is the okay check-in.
Yeah.
It's just the okay, are you okay? I'm okay. I'm not sure. I'm not okay.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad to see another iteration of that coming into play. That's awesome. Anyone else? Rue, go ahead.
Sort of like a mix between what Paula and Steffie said, because I'm also I don't have them with me here because they're at the community center where I run D&D, but I also have little like X and O cards or red, yellow, green cards that I set out for all of my players.
Awesome.
And I have like a line that like I think as myself is weird, in that I have a phobia of mushrooms growing out of human skin, and it's something that like it never occurred to me to like let people know that beforehand, because it doesn't come up very often, but it does in tabletop games come up quite often, especially when you're playing in horror settings. And so when I was thinking about it, like for myself, I was always like, oh, that's a silly thing to ask for, to ask that we avoid this. Like, this is such a silly thing for me to be putting out there. And so whenever I explain safety tools, I take a pause and like, I'm comfortable explaining this to folks and being like, so my thing is mushrooms. So don't think ever that something is too silly to X card or too silly to like slow down on. It's important that you know that like something that's bothering you, A, you shouldn't be forced to interact with, and B, might be bothering someone else who doesn't have the same like self-confidence to like speak forward about it. So in speaking about your own things that you need to slow down on, or that you need to, that you'd love to continue with, you also are speaking for someone who might not necessarily have the confidence to do it themselves. And so like I feel like having those safety tools at the table makes it not only so that you can protect yourself or encourage yourself, but you can also protect and encourage others. Because you can like put up a green card when someone's doing a really good job and you're really enjoying the like depth that they're putting into it. And that adds a lot of energy into the table, as opposed to everyone kind of like getting scared and not sure where we're going next.
Mm-hmm. Side note, I'm a tryptophobe. Like I don't like rashes or tiny holes or anything. So mushrooms growing out of skin seems like very reasonable to me.
Well,
yeah.
I'd love to throw something in here that actually sort of
Go
fits
ahead.
perfectly with Rue, and also is talking about how to make safety tools more accessible, and something I've actually said to a lot of folks who are, I wouldn't say anti-safety tool, but skeptical or unsure if it would even apply to them, or in groups where I ask for lines and veils and the sheet comes back blank. Is something I mentioned is we've talked a lot about phobias and discomforts and triggering things, and yes, put those on your lines and veils list if you have some kind of written list or a consent sheet, absolutely. But I also think it's worth discussing pieces of content that just aren't the vibe.
Yeah.
Like that is, as far as that goes, simply are not the vibe. And because once I started bringing that up, like my one of my friends has an insect line, and as I said, I mentioned this, occasionally bringing up things like mosquitoes, flies, spiders, they come up, and they'll come up casually. And so we kept apologizing to this person. It's like, oh my God, you must be in hell right now. We just keep doing this. I'm so sorry. It's in phrases and things. And she was like, I'm not traumatized. They make me, like, thinking about them makes me itchy. And then that's all I think about. And I'm not thinking about the game. And it's just not fun for me anymore. It's not going to cause an emotional response. And as someone who has a veil that I've been using a ton of just describing food too much, it's usually because streams throw my natural like eating times out of whack, and I'm either hungry or nauseous on streams. And so I'm not gonna, like, people accidentally eat an Eggo waffle on a stream and texting me being like, are you okay? Like, are you good? And I'm like, I'm fine. Like, maybe less overtly, that would be great. But like talking about the levels of safety tools, because lines and veils are not about how uncomfortable things make you, like veils are less, lines are more. It's how you want that media portrayed to the point that it makes you comfortable. So what we don't talk about very often is, is it tryptophobia, or does talking about it start making you think about this movie you watched a couple weeks ago that you'd rather not think about, and it's just going to distract you? Like what level of that? And that actually encourages a lot of people to who say like, oh, I have no lines, no veils, I'm not scared of anything. Once I start introducing the not the vibe, one of my friends who didn't have any lines or veils was like, I'm not feeling children being kidnapped. Like, I just don't want it.
I love that.
It's like, it won't cause me to have a panic attack. I won't freak out. But like, I watched a movie last night, and it was that was enough for the week.
Yes.
I love that. Yeah.
And it really reformats all of safety tools for those people who are like, I'm tough. I don't freak out. I have no fears. That's not the point. It's not fears.
Yeah. I have that with excessive gore. Like, I don't mind. It does nothing for me. I have that when I watch horror movies too. Like, I don't mind the occasional gore scene, but if your entire movie is based on gore, I don't feel anything. It's
just a little much.
Interested.
It's not the vibe.
Exactly. So I don't mind if that's in your game, but if that is all of your game, then your game is not for me, because I don't know. I don't mind. I'm not scared of it. I just don't care for it either. It does nothing.
True.
This like sort of like the same concept but opposite side. This also gives a lot of space for like putting in what is the vibe, and I really like the phrasing that you've used of like rather like, because a lot of streamed games that I've participated in the consent form have like a what do you want to see in this game, which is kind of like a really vague and open-ended question. Because that I will stare at for a long time and be like, what do I want to see? But asking more of like, what is the vibe? What things at this table would make you really happy and enthusiastic to be here? Like, what do you really want to explore? Lets you like talk about that and give that information to your GM, or in a GM-less game, your fellow players. And then all of you know what everyone's looking for, and like you can work together to like implement those aspects and make sure that those stories get told.
Something I actually add to my lines and veils whenever I do them is what I call roads, which are things I want in the game.
I call
So-
them highlights. They're so good.
Nice. Yeah.
Yes.
But-
Stars.
Stars and Wishes, Roses and Thorns.
Thorns.
There's a bunch of other ways of doing this, and those positives are kind of what I want to focus on a little more in this panel, because again,
Yes.
we see safety as very much like what not to do, what not to put into your games. But I've been exploring games a lot like Dread and Bluebeard's Bride and stuff like that recently, and there is an invitation to sort of explore taboo topics in a way that is sensitive, even helpful for survivors. Like, as a survivor of sexual violence myself, I don't actually have trouble playing Bluebeard's Bride because of the way it's portrayed, right? Because it's always portrayed as a power relationship. Now, if someone were to portray it as like a sensational, tantalizing thing, then I would have a huge issue. But Bluebeard's Bride is very open about it being like this squishy, fleshy power relationship, and playing with people who understand that has been really helpful and very safe for me. So, like, sort of on that line, let's talk a little bit more about roads or highlights, or how to ask people what they want in your game. Go ahead.
So I've noticed this more with like a lot of the indie games I've been reading recently, because I also run like Dread, Bluebeard's Bride, 10 Candles. And one of my current favorite games, which I actually ran yesterday here at Virtual HorrorCon, is called Something Is Wrong Here. And
Yes.
I'm obsessed with it. And if you haven't watched the VOD, it's really good. But the cool thing it has is essentially, like, I hate to call it a menu, but it has what it calls keywords, which just goes down the line of like identity confusion, surrealism, uncanny, meta, bleed, unsettling, abuse, suicide, depression. It lists everything this game has in its text that could be triggering. And it's like, this is the buy-in to the game. And so I send that out to my friends when I was playing home games of this, and friends would respond back, cool to all of that, maybe not the suicide. I'm like, great. So I find where in the game it mentions those topics, and I rewrite them, or I'm like, okay, don't choose that playbook. Like, it's going to lead down a bad road for you. And having that conversation of, here's what the game wants, because we're talking about what the players want. There are definitely, there's a person I play with who isn't allowed to play Sleepaway because it's just too bought into one of their lines. And so the game wants something, they want something else. They shouldn't play the game. Like, there's too much rewriting that would have to be done. So talking about what the game wants, and then saying, okay, here's what I'm trying to run. Here's Bluebeard's Bride, right? It talks about sexual abuse, power dynamics, all these things. And then it's worth bringing in, okay, here's what the game wants, though. It's 5 players playing 1 woman. The GM is always outnumbered. Does that help? No. Like, what would you want beyond that? What do you want to see happen? With that power in place, what would you like to see the game? Where would you like to see it take you? Right. So tying in, especially those like very event style systems where like you can't play Alice is Missing like in different ways. You play it the one way. Yeah. And so it's asking for one thing, players are asking for another, and trying to find where everyone wants to be so the game thrives, the players thrive.
I love that idea of sort of being in conversation with the game. I think that's awesome. Especially, you mentioned the Bluebeard's Bride because we were talking about that. I love that it gives like 4 different overarching themes and then sub themes of each, because there are so many possibilities. Unlike Alice is Missing, there's so many possibilities of playing that one way, because I think there are only like 6 endings to Bluebeard's Bride, 6 or 8,
something like that.
And
yeah, there's like 6, I think, different variations.
Yeah, but there's 1,000 different ways you can get there, and knowing what your players don't want and knowing what they want allows you to lean harder into what they want. And I think the way you talked about being in conversation with the game was awesome. Anybody else?
I think in terms of just like when we say about roads and just like scope and what the scope of the game is, know that there's limits, obviously, how far you can stretch a game and stretch a theme. Like it's like goes back to the old adage, you can't use D&D for everything. But I also think we shouldn't encourage, like, realize as the GM, sometimes you need to be flexible, especially with like tones and stuff that are not okay with your players. And just realizing that sometimes at the table that you want to bring the game to overall is just not going to be a good fit.
Yeah.
Like I run my table anyways. It's a very casual table. They play games, they enjoy games. They don't really get too serious into it. It would not be the table that I would bring Bluebeard's Bride to, because I don't think that they would.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say handle the themes, like maybe on their own they would be, but together they just don't see gaming connected like that. And I think
Yes.
if you force that, you're just only going to put yourself in a bad time. And I mean, the GM's feelings are just another part of wall connected to the players.
Oh my god, I once had a Bluebeard's Bride game at Gen Con where two of the players were a boyfriend-girlfriend duo, and they just decided to turn Bluebeard into like this weird fitness fiend, and it wound up kind of ruining the table because they kept talking about how Bluebeard liked doing squats, and I was like,
not the vibe.
Not the vibe.
No, yeah, and I think it's fair to say, because you've got these D&D, and I actually like 5th edition a lot, but you've got people who are like, oh yeah, you can run anything with it, and then they hack the hell out of it, and I look at what they do, and I'm like, you want to run Gumshoe, you should pick up Gumshoe instead of doing whatever it is you're doing here with D&D. This is not the game you want to play. Yeah, I think it's fine to look at what do we as a group, and that means everyone at the table, including the GM, want to play. And is this the game that will give it to us? And sometimes you might go, this is a fantastic game, but this is not the game for us.
So, Rue, did you have something?
Sorry.
Rue first, and then Paula.
I didn't have anything to say. I thought you were muted, but my headphones went out. That's my fault. Please continue. We're all good. Sorry.
We're good. Good checking in. Good job.
Yeah. I think another thing, along with like conversation with the game in terms of like the game's text and the game's rule set and the mood of the like source material, is also I'm really big on having a conversation with the session, both like during the session, like doing like whether it's check-ins or like doing like character integration and de-integration exercises, where folks can like spend some time getting into their characters, spend some time getting out of their characters together, so that like everyone feels in the moment, but also has that degree of separation in terms of how much bleed you want at your table and how much bleed you can handle as a person, and doing like session conversations where it's like, especially for longer term campaigns or homebrew things, where it's like, hey, this is what we did this session, and then bringing in tools like Stars and Wishes or Roses and Thorns, where it's like, hey, I loved this session. There were a couple of things about it though that I'd like it if we could shift in the future. I would like it if we can do more of one thing and maybe a little bit less of the time that we spent in the like slaughterhouse. We got a little bit too much of that this time. Can we pull back on that and explore something else? And I think like using Roses and Thorns, or for folks who don't like that tool, Stars and Wishes, because they're very similar, but the phrasing can change for things for some people, gives everyone at the table like the agency to feel that they have some level of not necessarily control, but say in how things progress throughout your playing of a game. And that way, like everyone knows that their input like is appreciated and matters, and they can make suggestions for things they would like to see throughout sessions and stuff. So having conversations not only with your system, but with the very adventure you're currently in, and like having conversations with how that like how what you wanted going in is or isn't being met by the current circumstances.
That is awesome. I love that a lot. Side note, I've been listening to a lot of like cult podcasts and like deprogramming podcasts, and something that keeps coming up is cult, especially like business cults and cults like NextVM have this thing like, oh, if you get your attachment met, that means you're just like getting your surface level needs met, and that doesn't actually mean anything. And I think talking about how we can get our needs met in games and how we can communicate which needs and wants we want met allows us to be more in community with each other. And I think that's just beautiful. Yeah. So speaking of which, I am a huge believer in the idea that games are a low consequence environment for high consequence emotions. Even if you're just murder hoboing the whole time, you're still killing people in a low consequence environment. So, but I would love for like a little anecdote or a story of a time when a game allowed you to experience a high consequence emotion in a low consequence environment safely. I can go first if people don't want to be put on the spot.
I actually have a really good anecdote about this.
Go ahead, Nick.
So I was recently playing, or not recently, about a year ago. Funny enough, Steffie will know this game very well. We were playing We Die Here with a private group of friends online, and something about, if you've never played We Die Here, it's one of the big themes is that you're coming back to a place, you're coming back to your hometown, you're coming back to a place that won't let you leave, that will not take its grasp off you.
Ooh.
And we were playing this, and one of the players that we were playing with this was someone that was recently graduating college, and it was going to have to move back home. And that game brought a lot of, anxieties and issues that they had that they weren't sure that they even had to the surface while we were playing. And we all had a fun time. And something that I wanted to kind of go off of what Rue was saying in the previous point is just the idea of like Stars and Wishes and like aftercare in general, like just having, a talk afterwards. It could be a 5-minute talk. It could be an hour-long talk, depending on what happens that game. But I remember after we were playing, We Die Here, that we sat down and our player sat us down and was like, hey, like this has been on my mind since we were playing this game. And it led to a really good talk. And at the end of it, they kind of came to terms with it. And they were like, even though they weren't treating the game as therapy, which I think is very important. I don't think that TTRPGs are an acceptable form of therapy. Like if you need therapy, you should go get actual
Unless
therapy.
you are doing it with a therapist.
Exactly. Yes. But the fact that they didn't know they had this issue, or they didn't know that this anxiety was like very deep within them, and that TTRPGs kind of helped bring it to the surface so now they could address it, was a really beautiful thing. And I think that's why we need these type of games that need these sort of safety mechanics, that need the sort of risk mitigation, because it's something you wouldn't know normally.
That's awesome. Paula.
Yeah, I have a similar story from myself. For like, it's a very small moment of role play that definitely was therapeutic, even though not therapy. It sort of taught me something about myself. It was, oh goodness, what system was it? I think it was GURPS. Weirdly enough, my friend runs it for me, and I don't know how to play still, but I do have a character sheet, and I role play, and then someone tells me to roll dice when I'm supposed to.
Nice.
But I was playing with my friend Bonnie, and our characters hated each other from character creation. And that was always going to be the case. We trust each other, we love each other, but we were going to fight. And we knew that. And there was a point where I was trying to propose a plan in character, and Bonnie's character kept fighting me on it, and kept finding some way it was wrong. And I would sort of get a little bit inflammatory or whatever. We'd try to fight a little bit, but there was something in my head that was like, stop the fight. Shut it down, like and so my character started making all these accommodations, like, oh, we'll do what you want, we'll do, no, it's fine, like, why don't we just make a plan, why don't we stop fighting and make a plan? And she kept going, she kept saying like, no, I don't want to make a plan, you started this, what do you want to talk about? And this argument's going, and in my head, in the meta brain, I was like, it's not stopping, I keep giving every signal that this fight should stop, why isn't it stopping? And then something clicks in my head, I'm like, she's fighting for the sake of character development. Like, she needs to have this fight between our characters for the story, for like the meta plot, for how this should go. I wasn't uncomfortable by fighting, but there was something deep within me that sees conflict and says that needs to stop. No conflict is allowed to occur because it makes me uncomfortable. Not in a safety sense, just in a self sense. And so I kept trying to, without even realizing it, shut down what she was trying to create, a scene. And my brain sort of clicked over, and I was like, oh, okay, bet. And I switched gears and I was like, you know what? No, this is your fault. And we went on for a bit and it was a really good fight. It forced the third character to come in and actually like establish their relationship with our fighting. And it became this like great dynamic for the group. But in terms of like how it affected me, it's something where it's like I try to shy away from intense conflict in real life because I just rather it didn't happen when in reality it needs to happen. Difficult discussions, hard topics. If someone says, hey, I'm uncomfortable about this, the worst thing I can do is say, let's talk about something else. I don't want to have a hard conversation. That feels like conflict. And so it was really nice to have someone who I trusted a great deal keep pushing and going, no, we're going to have a meaningless fight instead of getting to the core of it. First, we're going to actually hash it out, have this back and forth so we can naturally get to the core of it in a way that life would emulate. And so it was a really interesting experience of role play.
That's really cool. Rue.
I had the like pleasure of getting to do a streamed playtest of Deimos Academy, which is Game & Curry's new like horror coloring book RPG where you play as students who are back at your like horrible boarding school for like a class reunion. And like sort of like as someone who had a difficult time in school, like those sorts of situations, like playing a character who is revisiting the trauma of being in school, and very specifically like the trauma that is associated with like Catholic schooling and religious schooling, and things like that. But like getting to explore them at a table with people that I trusted, we were able to sort of like, because one of the mechanics is that when you pick up objects, you describe memories, and depending on if you roll well or if you roll poorly, you receive a traumatic memory about that object and about your time at school. And so like those sorts of things are really heavy and like really deep. But the game itself gave really nice tools to explore them in a way that was safe and a way that was also like really empowering for me to like not unpack my own trauma at the table, like in a like that's not quite the phrasing I want to use, but like let my character unpack their trauma in a way that felt empowering to me out like from an external perspective. And like
catharsis almost.
Yeah, like cathartic of like giving so much agency to take these objects that have and these stories that have been used against you and these things that have really harmed you and are weighing you down, and sort of work through them and like like sometimes depending on the scenario you're in, literally like excising the ghosts of your past that like follow you wherever you go. And I like it was just like it was a very like powerful like table to be at, and like we had a pretty long decompression afterwards where we all checked in because all of us had explored some very like dark themes with the objects that we interacted with and stuff. But it was very like cathartic, and like afterwards I actually felt lighter having played.
Awesome.
And it was just like such an amazing time.
Steffi, did you have one?
No, I don't have a specific anecdote. I will say that I love playing characters like the one that Paula described. I don't like PvP, like actual PvP, because it's really hard to de-escalate once one character stabs another character. But I do love to fight in character. I adore being a messy bitch with messy relationships with everyone. And so one thing that I really value as a player is a keep going sign, whether it's the little green heart or a hand gesture, because my character is going to pick a fight with somebody else's character, and I as a player need to know that you're on board, because otherwise I'm just going to pick a fight with somebody else. And so I think that a keep going mechanism is so vital if you want to play, I don't want to say nasty characters, but like slightly antagonistic ones.
I actually have two anecdotes that are the same anecdote. Nick ran a Contagion Chronicle series last year, and I was in the Geist one-shot and the Deviant one-shot for Chronicles of Darkness. And something that I sort of grew into in both the tabletop and LARP community, because My first ever parlor style LARP was vampire. And I grew up playing D&D and vampire, so there was this part of me that's like, if your character dies, you have failed, right? So there's a lot of unlearning there. I've gotten a lot better about it, but something I wanted to do going into Nick's games is I wanted to be able to explore and deal with character death. And like not feeling like I somehow, as the oldest child who needs to be protecting everyone and who needs to do the best at everything so mommy and daddy will love me, really needed to understand that character death could be just as fun as winning. And my character in the Geist game was a hard-ass former Marine who had died in the line of duty and came back and wound up sacrificing her immortal soul to get the other two Geists out of the Deadlands. And her last conversation as she is sinking into the sea of Lathe was, did I do a good job?
Oh,
I remember this, and
Yeah.
I think I responded with, "You did a spectacular job."
Yeah. It was very heart-wrenching. I think everyone on stream was a little weepy after that. And the other one was the Deviant game, where there were several Deviants who were able to, if I remember correctly, we were trying to get away from the conspiracy because we were the source of the contagion.
Yeah, the deviants, they use the contagion to make deviants, and you're
Yes.
trying to get this little girl out of the city.
Yeah, trying to get out of there. We did it, but then we slowly coalesced into a pillar of black basalt, and that actually, this was run as a prequel game after the end of the final game where they used the pillar of black basalt to end the contagion, and they had no idea what this pillar was or why it was important, only that I could end the contagion. And our characters' deaths in the end of the prequel provided that key, and that was such a huge moment for me. And I loved that I felt safe enough and like comfortable enough to be able to be like, no, my character is going to die and nobody is going to make fun of me for not having built my character properly or whatever. And that was awesome.
Oh, Ru.
Oh, if you want to go first, you can go ahead, Nick.
Okay.
I'm gonna say Ru go first. And
Yeah.
then Nick.
Oh, okay. Sort of like something that like you were talking about character death, and that like really like reminded me of something. I GM a lot more often than I play. By choice, I like to GM. And like I have some players who have similar hangups about character death, because they've been raised on D&D, where death is the ultimate failure of your campaign because you can't solve your quest anymore. And so like I've been working both with myself and with those players to like talk about situations where character deaths can be meaningful, and situations where character deaths, because death isn't a failure and death isn't the end all be all of your experience with this game either. And especially like in systems where death just kind of happens, whether it's like a Cthulhu game, because death is a lot more prevalent in those, or games with higher stakes. If you're playing in a system like D&D, or a system like a Powered by Apocalypse system where there are higher stakes, and like getting to talk to my characters about like obviously I'm not going to like throw something at you that kills your character meaninglessly, but how do we meet at a space where this is a final conflict and death might be an option? How do we make that death, if it happens, satisfying for you? How do we plan for a death for your character that will make you feel like their death held meaning, and that they will be remembered by either the other characters or by the universe as itself? Like, how do we make sure that you as a player, or me as a player, know that your character's life had meaning, and that in dying they don't lose that meaning? And I think that's like a really fascinating thing to explore.
I love that. It was also incredibly difficult for me not to use Cult Divinity Lost's tagline there, which is death is only the beginning. Like, oh, okay, excuse me. But Nick.
Oh, I really like that story about, that character death is not the end all failure, and I feel like unfortunately we get that standard from like power like fantasy gaming, which D&D is a power fantasy, and so of course your ultimate warrior or ultimate wizard dying is going to be considered a failure, but going off of Rue points, death can be beautiful, and I think a game that really emulates that really well, and I know this gets brought up almost as much as Changeling, is 10 Candles. Because 10 Candles, and there's a load of other games that do it as well too. It sets you up and tells you, by the end of this game you're gonna die.
Yeah.
And really, without trying to go on too much of a tangent, it's not about surviving. It's about what can you accomplish in the time that you have remaining left. And it goes on to an old adage I have about horror media in general. I particularly dislike when a horror movie, a horror story, a podcast ends with the antagonist, the opposing force, the monster, whatever you want to call it, kills the protagonist and then continues on like nothing happens. I hate that in movies. I hate that in slashers because it's like, why did I even watch this movie? Nothing changed. The beginning and end are just the same. The bad guy gets away. And that's not to say I don't like, the main character dying or protagonist dying. I love it when it happens, when it's does something meaningful, when you stop the antagonist. And I think getting people to associate your acts are better than, survival is not the end all be all. Immediately is going to set your players down a path to take risks, to throw themselves into the breach, as it were.
One of my favorite sayings is drive your character like a stolen car.
Yeah.
It's a good one. I would love to talk a little bit because I think we're running up on the 10-15 minute mark here. I want to open the floor. I want to open the chat to questions. So chat, if you have any questions, please drop them in. While chat types in questions, I would love to talk a little bit about like unusual or personalized safety mechanics you may have seen. Like I have friends who run a Sunday game, and their safety mechanic is, if you are in this game, you are consenting to being bullied in and out of character. You are consenting to horrible things happening to your character. You are consenting to, once a week, this is our game where we get to be horrible to each other in this like 3 to 5 hour period. And then we all go out for drinks afterwards. And then we're all good. Like that is their safety mechanic. Nobody goes into that game who doesn't know what's happening, and nobody stays in that game who doesn't want to participate in that sort of thing. Paula.
Yeah, this was the thing I was going to add on to Nick's 10 Candles comments, so it all ties in. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
So I run a lot of 10 Candles too, and I also run tons and tons of GM-less games. I got tired of GMing one day and I said, y'all do the work. So the thing I had to teach my friends in my home games and then the people I play with on stream is, if they don't know already, and D&D doesn't teach this, is communal storytelling. If you say I want to search the car, I say, okay, what do you find?
Yeah.
They're like, I don't know, you tell me. Like they don't know, they don't have that kind of like, especially if they don't GM. And a lot of that ties into safety. It's like you bring a thing into the world. If I'm doing a GM-less game, I say, everyone look at the lines and veils, because we're all adding things to the story, and I want everyone to have the same level of confidence. And my favorite game to teach communal storytelling and agency, and like it's not just your character versus the world is also yours, is 10 Candles, because there's a guaranteed end state.
I love
so
that.
If they succeed, if they search the car and they succeed and they get narrative control, and I say, okay, what do you find? And they're like, a gun. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, it's loaded. I'm like, yeah, go on. And they're like, I can give myself anything. And it's like, yeah, please. And they're like, okay, I'm like 3 grenades. And I'm like, great, awesome. And they're like, I'm allowed to do that? I got a success and I can give myself whatever I want. Great, I want a bazooka. I'm like, cool, you're going to die at the end. Like, it doesn't matter what you give yourself. You can experiment with good and bad. And usually people start to find that if the game swings like too many good things are happening, too many bad things, it starts to be boring, or the arc of the story doesn't make sense. And then they start to see what I see as a GM. And they start to track the plot and feel it, because what's great about 10 Candles is you start here, you end here, and the arc is up to everyone. And so I love that game because it shows you that you can have agency, and what you add into a game is entirely yours to do.
I love that. Also, like as a GM, I'm going to be like, okay, why do you find grenades in this car? What
Yeah.
in this car explains why there are grenades in this car? And then they usually freak themselves out by putting something far worse in than we could have thought of.
Yeah, and it's also that idea of like, okay, if you can convince me, do it.
Mhm.
Like, okay,
Yeah.
the car belonged to an army vet and they were stocking up. Where are they now? Like, are they going to come looking for their stuff? Like that kind of, okay, you started something, you're allowed to finish it. Like, you know the world as much as I do. Just play into it.
Anybody else?
It's a mechanic that I was recently introduced to in a session 0 for a game that I'm playing next week. Yeah, next week. Our GM, like both for PvP combat or for PvE combat, I guess it's like
Yeah.
has a safety tool in place where they will type into the Zoom chat or the Discord chat, whatever we're using, like hit ? And like check in with a player before they like initiate that combat. Or if you a PC are attacking another PC, you would also like type their name and the word hit with a ? And if they want that, they will reply with a hit !
Nice.
And so just like doing that like quick, like really short, like, hey, this is something that's happening in the like cycle of events, but if you don't want it to happen, it doesn't have to happen like that. And it was like really cool because I've never played at a table where like combat or conflict was opt-in such a simple way. Like it was always like part of like lines and veils, but like having such an easy tool that's like, hey, we're about to enter a like combative situation. Is everybody ready for that? Is everybody interested in that? Was just a really cool thing that
I
I've never
love
seen.
that. That's
Yeah.
really cool. Steffi or Nick?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about customized safety mechanics because me and one of my regular co-authors, Liz Tripolitical, wrote City of Flesh. I'm going to hold it up because I have it with me.
Yay!
Oh, it's not sure there. City
There
of
you go.
Flesh. So it's a game set in the rotting womb of a dying colossus. People built a city, and that does about as well as you would expect a city built in the rotting womb of a colossus to do, which is to say not well at all. So the city is going to die because the era is changing from magic to science, and in magic, colossuses can't die, so you can't build a city on their corpse. And in the age of science, colossuses don't exist, so you can't build a city on their corpse. So the city is dying, and we're calling that the Doom. So what Liz did is she wrote a safety mechanic specifically for the game, where you say and do things that are in character, that signal to the GM that you need to change things up. So it has tap the table once and say, I feel the doom. And that means I'm uncomfortable, but we can keep going. You can also tap the table twice and say, the doom creeps up. And that means I'm not comfortable and we need to wrap up this scene. And then the third is you tap the table thrice and you say, this is not my doom. And that means I'm uncomfortable and we're quitting this scene.
Hashtag not my doom.
Now. Hashtag not my doom. Yeah. And I think that is a wonderful game, a wonderful way to keep in character and keep the mood and keep the vibe, but still indicating like, no, we are not doing this.
I love that.
Because it's a creepy game with a lot of body horror and things that happen. Yeah. So and I love that Liz wrote mechanics specifically for that.
Adding that to my list. Nick?
Just to, keep it simple, I do a deep, long breath, inhale, exhale at the end of every one of my horror games. If you ever watch any of my streams, you'll probably see it. Because it's just something of a bookend to be like, all right, we're out of the game, we're dropping in character, let's resume, go back to our normal lives, which hopefully have not been deeply affected by this in any negative way.
Yeah. I love a somatic element to any safety mechanic. So like tapping the table, taking a breath, walking around. deciding that this room is
Yes.
where the nasty stuff happens, and if you walk out of that room, you don't have to deal with it anymore. Anything like that is awesome. We do have a couple of questions before we wrap up, so these should be able to be answered relatively quickly. They kind of tie into each other, so I'm just going to ask them at the same time, and you can answer them however you like. Suggestions for wanting to play in games which have some really dark themes and finding tables for it. And also suggestions for redirecting a player when something another player brings in is not the vibe.
Yeah, for the second one, I'll jump in and say, if you're a GM and a player says something that's not the vibe, it is definitely good to like look at the group, see what the response is, if it's personally something that offends you, or speak up,
Mm-hmm.
But I want to mention that the GM isn't the person in charge of safety necessarily. They can introduce safety tools, they decide which safety tools they want to use for the game, they speak for the game's consent and content. But if someone is doing something that's not the vibe, it is not your failure if it is not the thing that's bothering you. If you think, oh, this other player might be uncomfortable, I should speak up before they do, that's maybe overthinking it. So if they are, playing a different game than the rest of the group, it's definitely worth having a conversation and communicating immediately, but definitely don't over assume and be like, well, I'm fine with it, but they could, I don't know if this person said something. Don't try and think for other people, like invite the conversation to happen as a group.
I like that.
Something that I'm really interested, like something that I use a lot in that situation as someone who GMs a lot, is like if I know that something that someone has said is like close to or might be at a line or veil for another player, but they haven't, like that player hasn't stepped in personally, I will either during the session, if it's like egregious, or afterwards message the affected player and check in with them and see like, hey, I wanted to see how you were doing. I know like we might have touched on some things that you weren't comfortable with. Is that something you want me to speak to the other player about? Is that something you want to speak to them about? Or is this something that we're okay just leaving in this session and moving on from? And like putting the onus and the power in that person's court, as opposed to as the GM, like being the only safety consultant at the table. I think that everyone at the table, if you're playing at a safe table, should have the authority and tools to be a safety advocate for themselves and others.
Yes.
But you always want to make sure that the affected party is the voice that is the loudest and the clearest.
That is shit I do love to hear. Like right up there. Hell yeah.
Yeah, and I will say that people need to not be afraid to handle out of character problems out of character, because very often you'll see threats like one of the other characters being a total dick to my character, and they're not stopping, and I've done these things in character to get them to stop, and they're not stopping. Did you tell the player that you as a player do not like this and they need to cut it out? Because that might just solve it. Like maybe they're not picking up on the clue that your character you don't appreciate this. Maybe they think it's a fun thing, maybe it's a lark. And and then if you've confronted that, then they keep doing that, then it's time to have the talk with them, which might involve, you need to leave my table. But very often I see people struggling to find an in-character solution to something that is just an out-character problem.
Yeah.
Going to the first point, the first question about finding a table for really dark themes. Honestly, the best advice I could probably give for that is just be up front. I know that. So, for those that don't know, I was actually supposed to run. Jax would know because I've asked you. We're supposed to be in this game. It never really got off the ground, but we were supposed to do like a very like heavy, like past R-rated cult game for Discord because people wanted to see that. It was one of the incentives. They wanted like a really hardcore horror game. And I remember I put my intention on the table. It's like, these are the themes. These are what we're going for. These are the non-negotiables. These are the negotiables. Are you in? And I always say when I ask people, I reassure them, if this is not for you, that's okay. Yeah. And there are some people I don't ask specifically if I know that like there is there's a line, there's a veil that they have, because I don't want to put them in that that situation where they're like,
Mhm.
I don't want to say no, and then they end up joining something and being uncomfortable. Because I can guarantee you, if someone's uncomfortable at the table, it's going to spread. It might take some time, but you'll
Yeah.
know eventually, and it's gonna really sink the rest of the game. And it's not their, it's not their fault. It's not anyone else's fault. It's just recognizing what your table has versus the needs of that particular player. So just be honest. If they're the type of person that they're gonna judge you because of the themes you want to explore, then they weren't the right player anyway.
Mhm. Yeah.
And be explicit, because your dark is not my dark.
Yeah.
So people can say, I want to run a dark game. I don't know what the fuck that means.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess honestly, y'all have answered the questions the way I would have, because honestly, it's just be honest. Be honest with what you want. That is one of the first steps with any kind of safety and risk mitigation, is be honest about what you want and what you want to want. And those are two very different things.
Yeah.
And being honest is just, it makes everything so much easier. Paula.
I know we're towards the end here, but I want to toss in too, because it hasn't been mentioned, for getting those dark games together. Know and remember your players, whether it's stream or home game. My home group has called themselves the bespoke players, and that's because I met them all in different places. And then I introduced them to each other, because they're all of my friends from different gaming groups who wanted to go darker. And someone had a body horror line, or someone just had a horror line, and they knew I was a horror GM, but they wanted to see what the game could really do in that like darkest sense. And so I've been scooping them up for the last like 6 years, honestly, and been dropping them into this one game group. And you see that happen with casted actual play shows in a way too. So if you play with someone and the game doesn't go dark, but you see someone who's just always on board and matching you and like getting that like same energy going, remember them, because they will probably play darker if you ask and talk to them, communicate, start meeting who the players are that you're playing with, and then get to know what they could do if unleashed on the world.
I love that. All right, we're almost at time, so we're just gonna go back around. Just reintroduce yourself, your pronouns, where people can find you, something if you have a project you're excited about or something you're working on, please tell us that too, and then we will wrap up. Let's start with Steffie.
So I'm Steffie. I write horror games. You can hire me for that. You can also play the games that I've written. The best way to find me is on Twitter. That's 100 things I love. 100 is the number, 100 things I love. And then I've got a link tree and all of my games. If you like very weird, niche, macabre, tarot body horror, then check out City of Flesh, which does exactly what it says on the tin. And I've also got another game that Nick briefly mentioned, We Die Here, which is also what it says on the tin. You're going to run a game, or whatever happens at the end, none of you are going to get alive.
Nice.
Or most of you are
not. Nick.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Francia. You can find me at Nobleman Nick. I'm the production manager, marketing manager of Gehenna Gaming. Keep watching the con. That's all I can say. Where else you can find me? You can find me over the likes on Carrying Comfort Studios, as well as Devil's Hook Gaming. We have a Sunday show where we play Trinity Assassins. That's a lot of fun. And there are some awesome series about to come down the line that I'm just not allowed to talk about yet, but we'll see.
Awesome. Paula.
I'm Paula. I use she, her pronouns. I am art and audio on Twitter. I'm a horror GM, and I will be on a panel in 30 minutes right here. I'm on the next one.
Hooray!
So
what
catch
is it?
me there. It's about communication at the table, how not to be that guy.
Awesome. I love that you're going from a positive safety, how do we invite people to go darker, to how not to be that guy.
I know you said you didn't want to be like punitive and talk about like the bad person at the table and
focus
on them. I'm like, that's later. That's what I'm doing next.
I'm gonna have to watch that one, I think. Rue, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Rue. I use they or he pronouns. You can find me on Twitter as Ilana Night 13. That's ILANA, and then the word night like nighttime 13. And everywhere else as just Ilana Night without the 13. Because I made a Twitter at the age of 12, lost the password, and Twitter won't give it back to me now, 13 years later. But other than that, you can catch me tomorrow. I'm on a panel here called Tales from the Code, where we're going to explore taking mechanics and beats and atmosphere from horror video games and applying them to horror tabletop games.
Ooh.
And then other than that, every other Sunday you can catch me in a Blades in the Dark game on Huntsman's Hydra. And on the opposite week's Fridays, you can catch me on Bards and Brews, where I GM a Tal'Darai D&D campaign.
Awesome. Hello. I am Jacqueline Bryk, never Jackie, can be Jax Romana. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, and Femme. You can find me most places on the internet as Rufflejax. That's RUFFLEJAX, no underscore, no spaces. I have written on a whole bunch of stuff, including several Cult Divinity Lost books that are up for any awards, which I'm very, very stoked about. Please go pick up Beyond Darkness and Madness. We put a lot of love into that book, and it was beautiful. Also, please go check out the indie bundle for abortion access. I believe it's abortion access or abortion rights. I believe it's abortion access. Please go check it out on Itch. It has over 800 games at this point. I've put 3 of them in there. All of the funds go directly to the National Network of Abortion Funds. And I think there's a couple days left to go buy it. So please go buy it when you have a chance. And please keep an eye out for the next panel, which Paula will be on, called Communication at the Table, How Not to Be That Guy. All right, thank you all so much for hanging around, for saying yes, and that's us. Bye.